Okay, well, we're really pleased to have Bethany talk to us tonight. She's got a really wonderful group called the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Risk Management Network that addresses the question of how we can better manage for upcoming biological invasions in light of climate change. Bethany Bradley is a professor of biogeography and invasion ecology in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her research has a strong focus on terrestrial plant invasions with the goal of understanding how invasive plant distributions, abundance, and impact vary spatially. Her presentation will explore how planting native species can help to reduce invasions and build ecological resilience to climate change. So with that, take it away, Bethany.
Perfect. Thanks, Jill. And thanks so much, everyone, for coming today and for having me. I think this talk very much, I assume, because this is the Maryland Native Plant Society, that you guys are all already on board in terms of planting native plants. But I'm hoping that this presentation can give you a little bit more, information and science evidence about why we should continue to expand our focus on native plant planting. And sort of in a nutshell, what I'm going to talk about are three things. First is the importance of gardening with native plants for supporting wildlife. So that's probably an area that you're familiar with already. Second, the importance of planting native plants for reducing invasions and reducing future invasions, especially. And then third, the importance of planting native plants for helping ecosystems adapt to future climate change. And so Jill mentioned that I'm part of the Northeast Risk Management Network. Maryland is also part of the Northeast Risk Management Network. So if you're interested in topics, very much focused on invasive species and climate change, please look us up. Our website is riscnetwork.org, and that'll be on my final slide too. We do send out information about invasive species and climate change, and we also have a annual symposium each year that's all online and everything's free too. So, so if those topics are of interest, check us out. We also have a couple of resources. So my talk today is going to draw a lot on a couple of resources that we've put together through the Northeast Risk Network. And you can find both of these on our website in our various materials. One is a pamphlet on gardening with climate smart native plants in the Northeast, and the other is a pamphlet on why native species are beneficial for planting in a changing climate. So my motivation here is because I study mostly invasive plants, almost entirely invasive plants. And we know that almost all invasive plants come as introduced species. So they're non-native to a region and they're coming in. And so my motivation is looking back at the source of where most of those invasive species are coming from. They're coming in as garden plants. So this was a study from Kentucky from a number of years ago. And all of these proportions on here are various different plant taxa, but the important part is that about 70% of the plants that they found in nurseries in Kentucky, for sale in nurseries in Kentucky, were non-native to North America, and only about 30% of plants across nurseries in Kentucky were native to North America. So if a substantial portion, and I will argue this later, if a substantial portion of these go on to become invasive, then one way to avoid that problem later on is to focus on our native plants and increase our focus and exposure of the great native plants that we have available for home gardeners. So like I said before, I think you guys are already on board with planting native. And so this is just giving us more information on why it's great to plant native. So in terms of doubling down on our native plant gardening, the topics that I want to talk about today are first, those benefits of natives versus the costs of introduced plants to whether that's our home gardens or ecosystems generally. Second thing I want to talk about is some of our regulatory landscapes, so particularly for plant and invasive plant regulations and how those are failing to stop invasions. So the more non-natives we introduce, the more invasions we're introducing. And then last thing I want to talk about is gardens as conduits of plant movement in a changing climate. So basically thinking about the fact that we are already, by planting native plants in our gardens, creating movement of those plant populations and propagule sources, so sources for those for future plant populations in surrounding ecosystems. So we'll start with that first one, benefits of natives versus costs of introduced plants. I suspect that you are very familiar with these topics. A lot of these come out of Doug Tallamy's lab. In terms of native plants supporting native wildlife, it's very much about the caterpillars. Why is it about caterpillars? Because caterpillars are at the base of food webs. And so if you want to support, for example, bird populations, and especially baby bird populations, the bulk of what they're eating is insect protein. Most insects are specialists, and so that means that they either a given species or a given genus, that is the only thing that they can eat. And so as we introduce non-native trees, you end up with significantly fewer caterpillar species that those non-native trees can host, because you're basically cutting out all of the caterpillars that are specialists on particular native species. So native trees can support an estimated double or twice the caterpillar diversity as closely related non-native trees. And then there are a bunch of common non-native trees, like ginkgo is a good example, golden rain tree, Amormachia, that can only support 1 or 2 caterpillars. So those 3 trees support an estimated only 5 caterpillar species combined. Contrast that with native oaks, which can do upwards of 500. So if you want to support birds in your yard, the best thing to do is plant an oak tree if you've got space for it. This is just one example that was focused on chickadees. And so what they looked at was the numbers of native plants within urban and suburban yards and the success of nesting chickadee populations. And what happened was, as the native plant populations within urban and suburban yards declined below 70% native plants, the chickadee populations were declining too. And that is essentially because chickadees are eating those caterpillar proteins. And as you have more and more non-native or introduced species, you're supporting much less at the bottom of the food chain. So another way to look at that is this is a diagram from this Why Native pamphlet that we put together a couple of years ago. So essentially, if the bottom, if your host plants are mostly non-natives, then they're supporting a couple of caterpillars, which may become, a couple of pollinators. And those couple of caterpillars might be eaten by a handful of probably common birds. But if you have native plants, then you support way more caterpillars, which become a larger diversity of pollinators. And you end up with multiple trophic levels in that, kind of bottom up cascade. So those caterpillars can also be eaten by dragonflies as well as eaten by birds. And so ultimately, compared to traditional landscaping, if we've got a native focused landscaping, we've got something like 50% higher abundance of native birds, 9 times higher abundance of rare birds, more butterflies, more native bees. Generally, all of this leads to, yes, we definitely can see that native plants are supporting native wildlife. The converse of that is that introduced plants cause harm. So one of the biggest reason that we're concerned about introduced plants, in addition to the fact that they're failing to support native wildlife, is that those introduced plants can go on to become invasive. This is this is getting a little old now, but this is a meta-analysis study of invasive plants. And so essentially what a meta-analysis is in science is where you take all of the studies that have looked at impacts of an invasive plant, you gather all those data together and then you reanalyze them in a big group. So you might have, in this case, 20 or 40 or 100 different studies looking at the same thing. Ecology is really tricky, right? Because we end up with low sample sizes, so really small samples, and it's hard to say, well, was that actually because of the invasive plant, or was it because of these 10 other things that were going on at that given site? So the power of a meta-analysis is that you can take 113 different studies and see that when you put all of those things together, you end up with a significant, so that means statistically lower than zero negative effect of invasive plants on native plant diversity, for example. So all these bars that are to the left of zero are negative effects of invasive plants on native plant growth, abundance, diversity, fitness. Not all of the ones on animals are significant. Some of that is due to small sample sizes, but certainly in terms of the ones that we do see as significant, invasive plants have a significantly negative effect on animal abundance. So animal abundance declines, animal fitness declines in the presence of invasive species. So that's definitely bad as we introduce more species. The other thing that happens when we introduce plants is that they bring in new pests and pathogens. So for example, things like chestnut blight and hemlock woolly adelgid, both definitely chestnut blight, I'm actually not totally sure about hemlock woolly adelgid, brought in on the live plant trade. That is because live plants host sap feeders, foliage feeders, and lots of different pathogens. So all of the green bars on here are different species of pests and pathogens that were brought in through live plants. So anytime we import a plant from outside, we're bringing along a bunch of hitchhikers that can potentially be problematic, killing all of our chestnuts, killing all of our hemlock trees. I showed this graph before. This is nursery plant sales in Kentucky. Introduced plants are mostly getting here as ornamentals, and those ornamentals are going on to become invasive. So if you look at the sort of writ large introduction pathways for invasive plants in the US, so this is about 10 years old, but probably still holds true today. I don't think it's changed too much. We looked at about 1,000 different plant species, and some chunk of that was unknown. About 10% was accidental. So those are things like seed contaminants or contaminants in hay or something like that. About 60% were intentional, and the vast majority of those intentional introductions were through the ornamental plant trade. So basically, if you look at the overall thing, including things that we don't know the pathway of, about half total of invasive plants in the US were introduced intentionally as ornamental plants. So ornamental plants potentially a problem when it comes to invasions. So take-home point on this section is that planting native supports wildlife. It also reduces the risk of introducing problematic and harmful invasive species. The second thing that I want to talk about here are about regulation. So a little bit about the state regulatory landscape. In Maryland is interesting in terms of what the regulatory landscape looks like, because there are only about 6 species that are totally prohibited from sale. And then there's a whole bunch of other species where you have to have a label on it that says this species is potentially invasive. So this statement at the top, if the state isn't prohibiting the sale of a species, it must not be a concern, whether it's tier 1, tier 2, what have you. I know that you guys have just put together that really fantastic resource booklet for Maryland invasive plants. So you're probably already with me at this point, but I hope to convince you that this statement is false. So just because Maryland is not regulating a particular species does not mean that it is not invasive. I got a lot of negatives in that statement. Even unregulated species can still be invasive. In fact, many unregulated species are still invasive. So this is just one example of Japanese barberry, so Berberis thunbergii, easy to find in the ornamental plant trade. Lots of risk assessments and states agree that the species in it is invasive. Sales are not prohibited in Maryland, but some signage is required for Japanese barberry. Why is that? Well, in a lot of other states that have had big challenges with regulating Japanese barberry, the reason behind this is because this is a very profitable species, right? So it's evidently easy to grow, easy to propagate, and it propagates itself, in fact, into our forests. And so that makes it a nice species for the ornamental plant trade. So then the challenge is that as we start to regulate a species like Japanese barberry or a multitude of other invasive plants, what we have right now is essentially a patchwork of inconsistent regulations across different states. So Maryland, for example, is down here in the 6 total species regulated, plus all of the ones that require a signage for selling those species. You can see that there's a big range in different states in terms of even just the total numbers of invasive plants that are regulated. Those range from 0 in states like New Jersey and Rhode Island, Kentucky, Louisiana, to up to 162 in the state of California. And hopefully just by looking at this, it's kind of clear that this doesn't reflect actual invasion risk, that, California regulating 162 species and Nevada regulating less than 20 species does not mean that the risk stops at that state border. So invasive plant regulations are really inconsistent. Most plants are listed or regulated by only 1 or 2 states. So there are about 500 total regulated taxa across the US states, and about 350 of them are only listed by a single or by 2 states. So that means that we're not very good at agreeing about which species are the most problematic invasives that we should be regulating, except for Canada thistle. We agree on Canada thistle. We looked into that a little bit to try to figure out, well, why is it that we are likely to have such inconsistency? And in the New England area, at least, we spent a lot of time kind of digging into the regulatory processes and how those operated, thinking, well, maybe it's because there's something in the regulatory process itself that would exclude some species, so that Massachusetts might rank something as high risk, where New York ranks something as low risk. We didn't find that was a problem at all. Actually, the bigger problem was basically that we have such a big bucket of potentially invasive plants, and that states have limited resources to actually assess those ones, that it was essentially just like a random draw of the potential invasive plants that are out there. And so if each state takes a random draw of hundreds of invasive plants, then you end up with this level of inconsistency, basically. So here's just one example of glossy buckthorn, just to go back to sort of the regulations. The gray dots on here are areas where glossy buckthorn is available for sale. So in some places, legally because it's not regulated, in some places, maybe not legally because it's supposed to be regulated. And we can pretty well see from this graph, that just because it's regulated in these states doesn't mean that it's not invasive in these, states that are right in between them. This is just another way of getting at that same piece of information. So this is how good of a neighbor you are as a state. So this is the number of species that are present in the state, but unregulated in that state. So using the sort of set of species that are regulated in the surrounding states, we looked at those, and then we said, okay, if those are the ones that probably should be regulated, for example, in the state of Maryland, then how many of those are present in the state and not regulated in there? So lots of species still present in a lot of states that we're failing to regulate. And the biggest challenge for all of this is because just about all invasive plants are still for sale across the US. So if we're not regulating them, if we're not saying we don't want to sell them, then it's likely that they're getting in. It's likely that they're available for sale, if not in local nurseries, then certainly in online sales. So this was a study from a couple of years ago where the UMass PhD student and an undergraduate spent a lot of time Googling to see if they could find records online of species for sale, almost 1,300 plants that they looked for. And the take-home message is that 61% of those invasive plants are still for sale, and they are widely for sale. You can see like actually kind of a hotspot here in the mid-Atlantic of lots of different nurseries selling known invasive plants. So basically, we're continuing to dig ourselves deeper into that invasive plant problem. And here's just a couple of examples of those invasive species that are still widely sold as ornamentals. So Japanese barberry, we already talked about a little bit. Silvergrass, miscanthus is another good example, widely sold and pretty well known to be invasive. It's only regulated at this point in Connecticut. Kogan grass, which is on the list of the world's worst invasive plants and on the federal noxious weed list, but there are some varieties. This red baron, I think is what it's called, variety that is sold across lots of different states. Another challenge in here is not only that the regulations are inconsistent, but also that the regulations are reactive. So why do we care about reactive regulations? Well, the challenge here is that invasive species ranges are shifting because of climate change, right? We've got lots of plants moving their ranges. So if we are only regulating what's already here, then we are missing an opportunity to stop things before they arrive. And this is the number of plants that are proactively regulated. So in Maryland, it does have a number on here. So it is possible, based on your regulatory protocols, to regulate species that are not yet present in the state. But on average, only about 11% of plants are listed proactively. And I said a little bit of this already, but why do we want proactive regulations? Because invasive species are shifting their ranges with climate change. This is a projection for Chinese privet expansion, so big hotspots in the mid-Atlantic, and expansion into some of the more northern areas that we know there's lots of privet invasion a little bit to our south. So take-home points in terms of what the regulatory landscape looks like. We know that known invasive species are still widely available for sale, and we can see that state regulations are ineffective for stopping the sale of known invasive species, which means we should plant fewer of them. All right, and then I want to focus then in the last section here a little bit more specifically on climate change and species range shifts. So you have probably seen a graph like this. I think these graphs are super cool because because plants underlie this pattern. So this is a CO2 sensor from the top of the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. So the reason that they put it there is because it's as far away from sort of cities and, like other things that might affect the record directly. So this is sort of a pure estimate of, average CO2 in the atmosphere. Started out, if we were able to go back in time to before this record started, at around 280 parts per million, and it's about 420s these days, so well up here. The sawtooth pattern is actually the phenology of northern hemisphere plants. So basically, the northern hemisphere has much more terrestrial land and plant biomass than the southern hemisphere does. And so when the northern hemisphere spring and summer are happening, basically everything's sucking in, the earth as a whole is sucking in a bunch of CO2. And so you end up with this sort of like down cycle in the sawtooth. And then when we get to northern hemisphere fall and winter, there's much less plant biomass pulling in CO2, and so you have this sort of upswing. So that's why you end up with this little pattern on here. Fun factoids to tell your friends. How do we know about climate change in the past? One of the best measures is actually direct measures of CO2 from ice core measurements. So this is an Antarctic ice core. One of these ice cores was actually about 2 miles long, and that's almost as thick as the ice gets in Antarctica. The way that these things work are essentially kind of like tree rings, in that every year, except vertical, so every year as snow falls in the Arctic and the Antarctic, you end up capturing some air bubbles in it, basically, and that hardens into ice as more layers get on top of it. And then they can infer temperature directly from the air bubbles trapped inside, because oxygen isotopes change with temperature. There's like a direct correlation between those two things. And they can also measure what the CO2 concentrations have been like historically. So basically the last glacial maximum is around here, when CO2 was down around 200. At that point, where I'm sitting in Massachusetts, there was about 1 mile of ice overhead. So big swing between 200 and 280, right? This is like we're covered in ice to we're ice free, right? Those two differences. The difference between today, or that pre-industrial, and where we are today is well more already, and we're headed higher than that change of 1 mile of ice over my head. So big changes ahead. That's, that underlies the concern about climate change. The other piece that's important in here, especially thinking about ecosystems and about the plants that we're planting, is that this is happening really fast. This is basically a straight vertical line in a 1,000,000-year time series. So even in these past times where, relatively quickly the glaciers melted over the last 25,000 years or thereabouts, that happened over 25,000 years. That gives native plants, or plants that were in North America, a chance to slowly disperse across the landscape, right? To migrate into those areas where there used to be 1 mile of ice overhead. These days, this is that equivalent of 25,000 years worth of change over less than 100 years. So super fast. Another way to put this, and I sit in Massachusetts, so I'm using Massachusetts as my example here, but this is if we put Massachusetts heat-wise to where it was geographically in the late 1900s. Where we are now is more like northern New Jersey in terms of what New Jersey's temperature was like in the late 1900s. And depending on what scenarios, how optimistic or pessimistic you are, Massachusetts may be joining Maryland by the end of this century, or it may be all the way down in South Carolina in terms of heat equivalent. If we're all the way down in South Carolina, then by the end of this century, that means that we have moved the geographic equivalent of about 800 miles in climate space. So the question, to compare that is, okay, well, can native species keep up with that? How fast are native species moving? The quick answer to that is not very fast. And this is a good example of a long-term study that looked at forest movement. So we know that you can't really expect forests to just like dash up the hill or something like that, right? I mean, trees don't move very fast. We probably knew that intuitively, but this is an estimate of exactly how slowly those trees are moving. So in 1964, there was a Forest Service survey in the Green Mountains, that's in southern Vermont, and they measured forest composition, and specifically they were focused on this transition between northern hardwood and higher elevation boreal forest trees. And then they went back in 2004, so 40 years later, and measured those same transects to see what had happened to this sort of northern hardwood boreal forest edge. And as you would expect, sort of in response to climate change, the northern hardwoods tree seedlings have been expanding upwards into elevation, and the boreal forest tree seedlings have been contracting from lower elevations. But over that 40-year period, the movement was on average 600 feet. So 600 feet in 40 years is how fast trees are moving versus 800 miles in 100 years that they need to be moving, right? We're orders and orders of magnitude off in terms of the speed at which, if we just left them alone, native plants could move in response to climate change. There are some species that we're doing a really good job of, though, in terms of helping them keep up with climate change, and those are ornamental plants. You've heard me talk about ornamental plants before, right? So how are we dispersing plants? Primarily through nursery sales. And what we're really good at with nursery sales is actually expanding the ranges of those species into warmer climates. So this is an example of actually a native species to Europe, the Saponaria or rock soapwort. This is actually one that I've been fighting in my front yard. So what is native and lovely in Europe is less attractive to me in Massachusetts. But what you're seeing in this kind of small graph over here is that all of the red range is the area that is the native distribution of rock soapwort in Europe. And then all of these green dots, which are a little hard to see, but they go all the way up here, those are nurseries that are selling Saponaria across Europe. And this example is actually for a native plant, right? It's a native to Europe being sold, but expanding its climate range in Europe into warmer climate conditions. But we remember from that Kentucky study early on that this is actually the minority of plants that are sold, that the large majority of plants that are sold through nurseries are non-native and non-native ornamental plants. And remember that a bunch of those ones go on to become invasive. It's also, I feel like it's really tempting to kind of look at this, and I do the same thing, look at this and say like, oh, the species that we know about in the US, like these 1,000 invasive plants, whoops, like that was a mistake that we made in the past, of intentionally introducing these as ornamentals. But maybe we've like learned today, like we're not making that same mistake today. But if you look at the landscape even a little bit in terms of what's being sold today, we're definitely making the same mistake today. This perpetuates in ornamental plant sales today. So essentially what we're doing is we are giving, instead of giving our native plants a head start with climate change, what we're doing is actually giving our non-native and especially our invasive species a huge head start in terms of climate change by planting them into warmer climates, by driving around with all this gunk on our boat into warmer lakes and stuff like that. So where we would optimally want to be helping the native species adapt and move, we're instead helping the non-native and invasive species do that. So take home point on this is if we want native species to survive, we need to help them move. And this species that's on here is Torreya taxifolia. Actually, I guess it's Torreya californica, but Torreya taxifolia is a poster child for what's called assisted migration, maybe something that you've heard about before. Assisted migration is the idea of humans helping native species move in order to adapt or pre-adapt to climate change, or the intentional introduction of species outside of their historic ranges into more climatically favorable regions. A lot of times there's a lot of concern, anxiety about moving native species because we know that, that we have done plenty of harm to ecosystems in the past, that people who work on these types of things and managers who are really thinking about native ecosystems and preserving native plants and animals are really worried about introducing something like that's going to then cause harm. And I fully appreciate that perspective of not wanting to do harm to ecosystems. The good news, though, is that the risk from native plant, and I'm going to put this in air quotes, of in a problematic species or an invasive species from native plants is very rare. So where in this study, 12%, I don't know what 350 divided by 3,000 is, more than 10% of non-native plants went on to become invasive. I guess I've got percent over here. I could just read it up there. Okay, 12% of non-native plants go on to become invasive. Way less than 1% of native plants were identified as invasive. And most of these were ones that were very much disturbance responsive plants. They were the ones where it was like, okay, we have a highly disturbed landscape, and we're seeing these sort of like weedy tendencies in some native plants, and which you see in plenty of non-native plants as well. Why are introduced species so much more likely to become invasive than native species? Well, one of these is potentially because of release from natural enemies. So for the same reason early on that planting native is really good because it supports all of these caterpillars, and those caterpillars become pollinators and they feed the birds and blah, blah, blah. Non-native plants are supporting very few caterpillars. The other thing those caterpillars do is actually eat the plants, right? Like that's what they're doing on your oak tree. And so if you are a plant that's a native plant that's being eaten by lots of different caterpillars, that keeps you in check a little bit, right? You can't just keep growing and growing because somebody is going to eat those new leaves as you produce them. And so you often, are investing in other things like, defensive thorns or something like that, right? If you're a non-native plant and you're introduced to a new area and nothing is eating you, then you have this release from natural enemies. And that is one major hypothesis in invasion ecology, that a good portion of the reason why we have invasive species is because they can grow bigger, faster, stronger, and they're not being controlled or eaten by these specialist insect herbivores. So if you don't have enemies, you can spend lots of time growing and reproducing and potentially having impact and becoming invasive. Another reason why introduced species are so much more likely to become invasive is a lack of coevolution. So chestnut is a good example of this, right? So you have a tree, you have a pathogen that attacks the tree. If those two things are existing, co-evolving, then the pathogen gets a little stronger, the tree either dies or it evolves a way to resist more of the pathogen. The tree evolves a way to resist more of the pathogen either dies or it finds evolves a way to become more virulent kind of thing. And so you end up with this evolutionary arms race for co-evolved species. And so by co-evolved species, I mean, basically any species across the eastern temperate forest could be co-evolved species. So this is happening, obviously, not just in eastern temperate forests or in North America, but it's also happening all around the world, including with Japanese chestnuts, for example. So chestnut blight, Japanese chestnuts had an evolutionary arms race over in East Asia, and that chestnut blight became very virulent, but the Japanese chestnut, because it co-evolved, was fairly resistant to that blight. Not so the poor American chestnut, because those two things evolved in very different areas. American chestnut did not co-evolve to have the resistance to chestnut blight, and so that's why we have no more chestnuts. This is true not just of pests and plants, but also plants and other plants. When you have things that evolve together in the same area, I don't want to use the word harmony, but that's because that's really not true of ecosystems. But at least early advantages to some species tend to get sort of evened out over time. So take home point on this is that relative to introducing non-native plants, assisted migration of native plants, so the deliberate movement of native plants outside of their native range, whatever we call that, is very low risk. So plant Torreya taxifolia, that it's unlikely to cause any harm to the ecosystems. there is still, like I said, concern among natural resource managers about the likelihood of natives becoming problematic. So there are some things that we can keep an eye out for, so native species that are really well known to be dominant are weedy in their native range. Native species that are known to do things like fix nitrogen or change the water cycle or something like that. Those ones could alter the ecosystems that they're introduced into. Black locust up in the Northeast is an example of a species that sort of continues to be ornamentally introduced and has escaped ornamental cultivation, and so has for a number of years been viewed with concern and skepticism as a species that may be problematic. So take home point, and then almost my last take home point, that we often think in terms of restoration, ecosystem conservation, any of the work that we're doing with promoting native plants in terms of first not doing harm to ecosystems. And it makes total sense to be concerned about harm associated with assisted migration and to try to minimize that by not introducing poison ivy, whatever, across your landscape. What I want to leave you guys with, though, is that doing nothing is also doing harm, that we are in such a place of rapid climate change that if we say, let's just let the ecosystems figure it out on their own, they're not going to do it. There's no way that species that can move, a few hundred feet in 100 years can make it 800 miles in 100 years. So I will leave you with some conclusions that our native species are not keeping up with current rates of climate warming, that assisted migration of native plants is low risk, especially in the context of all of the assisted migration that we're already doing with non-native and invasive plants. And then that last piece is that gardens of today, we know that species that we're planting in home gardens and home yards are getting into surrounding ecosystems. So the choices that we make today in terms of what we're planting, those are going to seed ecosystems of the future, which means we need to continue to make the good choices that you guys are promoting with the Native Plant Society. And all of this work has been in collaboration with the Northeast Risk Management Network. And the information a lot of the information I've talked about today can be found in our Why Native and Climate Smart Gardening syntheses, and our website is on this slide. So I'd invite you to check us out and join our listserv. We don't send that much information out, and most of it I think is pretty good. So thanks so much for having me, and I'm happy to stick around and take questions. I'm not sure what our timing is.
Thank you very much, Bethany. That was excellent. I think there's going to be a lot of questions. As they say, it's complicated. And we do have some hands up. We're doing fine on time. So the first, Susan, I don't know your last name, but your hand's up. So please go ahead.
Hi, Jill. Thanks. This is Susan McLaughlin. So hi, Bethany, and great presentation. I appreciate it very much. One thing that those of us who encourage gardening with native plants inevitably get into is what the definition of native. And I'm just wondering whether, you discuss the potential implications of planting, the cultivars and the hybrids and things that a lot of nurseries will label as native. There's a lot of disagreement over this, but
yep.
And native plants that are cultivars, the clones, things that aren't particular, not a local ecotype, and so on. If those are closer to natural populations, there's the possibility of affecting those populations, and how might that affect the ability to evolve and develop sustainable populations? Thanks.
Yeah. And there are there are native seed networks that are starting to pop up. Definitely, there's a ecological health network that's in the north, like the New England area, at least. I'm not sure if they're connected down in Maryland at this point, but a lot of thinking on those exact topics going into restoration professionals in particular. In terms of, I guess it depends how in depth your native gardeners want to get as far as like trying to source populations. I have a meadow in my front yard, and we just got seeds. We got seeds from Pennsylvania, basically. And we said, like, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out if we could source seeds from, or knew where those seeds were even sourced from. And it was like, we can't, So I think for most home gardeners, it's just a non-starter as far as like, oh, I really want the seed population that comes from Virginia and not from Delaware kind of thing, like I want to go south or something like that. You had a lot of comments, so I'm just going to sort of stream of thought, and then you can like adjust me from there. On the cultivars piece, so optimally, like if we had the optimal situation of what we would say to home gardeners, it would be find somebody who's sourced seeds that are from your south of you. Try to get plants that were grown from seed and not clones. If it's a cultivar, try to make sure that the cultivar is not changing the leaf color and not changing the flower shape, because those are things that seem to matter as far as like whether caterpillars will eat the leaves and whether pollinators will pollinate the flower shape. Yeah. From a home gardener perspective, though, we're not restoration professionals. And so I think that we can forgive ourselves a little bit for not being perfect on all of these things. And you're right, like if we all plant the same clonal native plant in all of our gardens, that's not going to do a lot to support populations. But my hope is that if enough native plant nurseries are starting up and sourcing from different locations and people are getting those from different places, that you kind of get around that problem, maybe sideways. But
thank you. I guess I'm wondering, as you develop this and market it, I agree, trying to sell to convince and educate most home gardeners on buying plants that are grown from seed, that's incredibly difficult. So I was just wondering what kind of message you might be putting out or reaching out to nurseries. I mean, it's a great thing to talk about it in this positive way. I just wondered to what degree you all thought about that at this point. So thank you, Bethany.
Yeah, and I forgot that your first question was like a definition of native too, which is a really important piece. I mean, my definition of native is anything in my ecoregion, which is like the Eastern temperate forest, which basically goes all the way down to like the Gulf Coast. I personally, but also as a scientist, am okay with that, because if you look at paleoecology of how much species have moved just through the glacial, interglacial periods, it's all the way up to Canada and all the way down to, the Southeast. So, if they had 20,000 years to do this instead of 100 years, they would be making those big migrations. And so from my perspective, I'm okay with helping them with that scale of migration.
Yeah, that's a really good point about ecoregions. I think having some guidelines to, if you're going to be moving things, to at least try to keep them within the geology, soils, and conditions that they're likely to do well in and that they've been in previously. I think it's really important to have those guidelines, because people might just hear this as, if it isn't presented really clearly, they might think, I can just get something from North Carolina mountains and plant it in my yard in the Piedmont in Maryland, and that'll be fine. So I just think that type of information needs to be clarified, and it is really tricky, but I think having some guidelines like that's really, really helpful. Okay, I'm going to shut up. Wendy has a question.
Hi, thank you so much. Great presentation and a very important one. So thank you for providing it, and thanks to Maryland Native Plant Society for providing it. So thanks. So my question has to do with extreme weather and the fact that we don't get just sort of a linear warming with climate change. People, in fact, are calling it climate weirdness and not climate change, because we get these cold snaps after a warm winter. We get, flooding after months of drought. I'm worried that if we work on moving southern species northward, that they're still going to get zapped with really cold winters and won't survive. So I know this sounds very depressing, but I don't really know how plants and trees are going to survive. I'm a little bit more hopeful for plants just because of a shorter generation time.
Yeah.
Possibility for evolution towards more, plasticity, perhaps even phenotypic plasticity, if not just genetic, variability. But trees, I don't know what they're going to do. So do you have any thoughts to share on this issue?
Well, I guess one of them is to build an expectation that we're going to lose more plants in gardens, that whether they're native or introduced species. You're absolutely right. The projections, I mean, we're living the future right now. The projections are for much peakier water cycles, so floods and droughts, but the average is about the same, probably. The longer growing season leads to, in Massachusetts, we had actually a normal frost this year, but it was mid-May. So it was like a 1980s normal frost, but it was warming up from like beginning of April. And so it just not, in fact, that actually was effective at controlling our knotweed populations for about 5 minutes after that happened. Yeah, things are going to die. I mean, like last summer, I lost a big chunk of meadow because we had 6 weeks with no rain and it was really hot in Massachusetts. And I don't know that planting more southerly species or planting more northerly species would have helped with that. I guess the best thing that you can do is to plant a diversity of species and hope that some of them are going to make it through whatever those extreme conditions are that we're going to be experiencing. I mean, if a hurricane comes through and like trashes a whole forest, then there's just not a whole lot that we can do about it. So maybe, so I'll just go back to that. And my initial thought on that is to keep an expectation that climate change is going to cause some havoc in our gardens and in our ecosystems, and that we should be prepared for that and expecting that. And also that diversity helps in those cases. And, I mean, assisted migration specifically focuses on moving species that like into areas where they weren't before, but there are lots of other species that have really broad climate, like hardiness zones, for example. You can find species that go everywhere from zone 5 to zone 8 or zone 3 to zone 8 or so, like they can go from Vermont all the way down to South Carolina. So those are also species that, and this gets back to can we source seed source effectively? But if we can encourage some of our native nurseries to think about seed sourcing and focus on, sourcing some of the seeds for the plants that they're growing further south, then that also is part of an assisted gene flow, I think is what we would call that, as opposed to assisted migration.
Deb, you had a question about insects moving along with the plants, and I thought that was a good question. Did I capture your question well enough?
It does. I wasn't sure if there was research out there or not about the insects moving with the plants.
I'm not sure. I know that, nurseries as a whole would prefer to like not be selling lots of insects on their plants. And so there are probably a lot fewer than there would be if we actually intentionally, grew a plant out in the woods and then moved it into a garden. sorry, I don't know anything about that topic. So I am gonna say probably fewer and I can look into it and see what I can find.
All right. Thank you. And how about Mark, you want to ask your question?
One of the important practical things to do is not only allowing the plants to go north where it's warmer, but also to go uphill where it's warmer.
Yeah, totally agree. So yes, if you're depending on where you are in Maryland, if you're in the edge of the mountains to the west, then absolutely looking for seed sources from just lower elevations and warmer places is another good way to go. Yeah, thanks for that.
All right, thanks, Mark. Okay, Chris, please unmute and ask your question.
Well, I actually had two at one point, but I think you've answered pretty much the first one with there just seems to be no one's quite sure, what's the climate's actually going to be down the future. And I was just concerned that, we were predicted to see, heat indexes of over 125 degrees, and that's mostly from humidity by 2050. And I can't think of an equivalent sort of climate, worldwide, because we're talking 125 degree heat. That's, Death Valley, but they don't have the humidity. And, even, a humid place like the Amazon, I don't think, hits, in the 120s. So I'm just wondering, if you're looking for, if we are to see these 125 degree indexes, where should you be sourcing plants?
Well, so my guess is that would be kind of like the extreme highs. So extreme, the lows and the highs are going up at some, those ones are actually changing, kind of faster than the averages, but most of the, sorry, I should start that over again. Most of the time, we spend a good chunk of the year not in extremes, fortunately. So there will be an increasing number of those hot days, as well as really wet days and really dry days. But if plants can survive that day or a couple of days, then they're going to be okay, even with a little bit of temperature rise. So I wouldn't say we should expect it to be 125 degrees, like all summer long. I mean, I hope not one of these days, but hopefully that'll be our grandchildren's problem or something like that. Yeah, so I guess I would go back to that previous comment about the expectation that we're going to lose some species and that things aren't going to survive in some of these extremes, and to be patient with our plants, and keep planting them.
Okay, do you mind if I ask one other quick question?
No, go for it.
And this is a little off the wall, I guess, but do you or anyone really suggest a free or low cost research or journal database where I can access research papers?
Where we can access research papers. So I don't think there, I mean, this is that we could talk for a while about academic publishing right now and the problems associated with that. The biggest problem is that a bunch of the biggest publishers are for profit. And so they want to make a profit, and they've got, universities kind of in a tough place, because universities need access to those research papers. But actually, as a professor, I write research papers, and then my university has to pay so that we can actually access the research papers that I've written. And also does they get a lot of my effort for free to write those papers and review papers, and then they get to charge for them. So that is a whole other topic, problematic space that we're in. The academics, academic research as a field is definitely moving towards more open source publications. The problem is that the academic or the publishers, the for-profit publishers especially, are now charging us both to publish them in open access and to access them if they're not open access, and also to like pay when we publish an article itself. So basically they're charging us for like every single aspect and making lots of bucks, and we're in a weird phase right now. So what I would suggest doing is, if you find a paper that you like, search in Google Scholar, because you will find, you'll find lots of content in Google Scholar. There are a lot of people who have posted their own PDFs of papers online that you can access directly through Google Scholar. If you can't access the paper through Google Scholar, I would say just start emailing authors, like email whoever you can find in that sort of front page and ask them for copies of it, because most people that I know are really excited to share our research. The other place that I go sometimes is ResearchGate. So there's a website called, I think it's called ResearchGate, where a lot of authors have actually posted PDFs that you can access. There are some rules about you have to wait 2 years or 4 years or something like that before you're allowed to post a PDF. But if it's slightly older research, you've got a better shot of finding it if it's behind a paywall.
So another thing you can do, by the way, is you can look at public libraries and what database access they have. I did just find, for example, the Enoch Pratt Free Library, Baltimore City's library system has a JSTOR access, and you can actually get an Enoch Pratt library card if you are a Maryland resident.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, David. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a quick one. It's sort of a summary question. I did notice a couple people asked about how other states, like which other states had been successful recently in improving their regulations. And I think sort of a bigger question is, at least in my mind here, is what are these states like California, who has 142 versus Maryland, who has 6? What have they done differently that's allowing them to actually do that regulation? I think that would be really interesting to understand.
Yeah, they have sources of funding that they have directed specifically at invasive species management in the state. So California is huge, so it's not I'll do a comparison with the state of New York. So the state of New York, through, I can't remember if it's like it's something like fishing licenses, but that's not quite it. So something like that is directed specifically at an invasive species fund, and that invasive species fund goes to fund managers in these, they call them PRISMs, which is some region of invasive species management. And they have, 12 of those across the state of New York, and they have a coordinator for New York invasive species research. And through those funds, they specifically hire an outside contractor to do risk assessments at a regular interval. And then once they've got enough risk assessments, they start pushing those up for evaluation at basically the policy level, because I'm not sure if it's their Department of Environmental Conservation or the equivalent that does all of the risk assessments, then can make recommendations of here's all the species that have come out at high risk from our risk assessment process. And then there's another stage where it goes into policy. So how do we get good state invasive species policy and regulation? We have to invest in invasive species management. And so speaking from the standpoint of New England states, everybody in New England looks with envy at the state of New York for having that as part of the way that they operate. That's what we need. That's what we need to do. There are a couple of upper Midwest states, so Minnesota and Wisconsin, I think both, that are also doing really good proactive invasive species management and sort of have that kind of written into their state laws. So that is, yeah, so we can spend a lot of time being like, here's our perfect risk assessment protocol, but if we never actually do any risk assessments because there's nobody to do that, then we're back where we started. So to the degree to which it's possible, if there are, state legislators who are interested in invasive species in Maryland, like these are the types of things that absolutely would be good to bring up.
Thanks.
That actually is a good segue into some other questions that are kind of in the chat about, what can be done about kind of legislation to do this. Somebody said, is it possible to pursue legislation that will educate the Maryland population on the harms of native plants? And then kind of discussion of what that legislation might look like. So I guess there might be a couple of people on the board that could possibly talk about kind of recent efforts on legislation in the Maryland legislature that have succeeded.
Well, there has been some legislation, but I think that Bethany is absolutely correct in terms of if there's a complicated process for evaluating invasive plants, for instance, and there's no budget to do that, those assessments, you can have wonderful legislation, but it's not very practical. So one of the questions that a number of people have been raising in conversations that I've been privy to is there legislation that maybe should encourage or require the state to look at other ways of assessing invasive plants that other states are doing, and look at adopting those protocols in legislation versus just having regulators put together something that is much more complicated. So for instance, I think the regulators, the employees of the Maryland agencies are perfectly willing to do these assessments, but they don't have any staff allocated. And this is the fiscal year that's about to start, July 1st. There was yet another attempt to get staff that would be hired to do these assessments. And that fell by the wayside. There was a budgeting issue. The request, the people who were requested were not allocated to the departments that needed them. So I think that point that Bethany made is very appropriate. In terms of education, I did mention this at a previous meeting, but there is important, and this is education for native plants. There's important legislation that just passed this year, which allows for various mechanisms to help educate people. That means, for instance, there would be a list of native plants created at the University of Maryland Extension that are commercial native plants. They're either already existing or they would be easy to commercialize. There would be labels that sellers could put in to individual plant pots, or there could be signage, and that would be handled by the Department of Agriculture, Maryland's best. And there would also be certification of growers and retailers so that the public could find them and could find out where to buy the plants. But there's an important difference in terms of how we've been handling in Maryland the invasive plant assessments, in that there actually will be a budget for that. That's part of the legislation. That the budget, it was too late when the bill got passed in this year's session. So the budget actually will first be available on July 1st, 2024. So there'll be a year delay, but that type of thing can really help with education. I don't know whether I'm completely answering the question here. There's an issue of supply. So that involves the growers and the retailers and the interface between the growers and retailers. And I think what's interesting is that the Maryland Native Plant Society just got an email today about the Association for the Landscapers and the Growers and the Retailers. There's going to be a conference next February, and they were looking for a speaker to talk about how native plants can be marketed so that could increase the supply of native plants available to people.
Cool.
So I think it's a multifaceted type of approach where it's got to be reaching out to the various contingencies on a non-legislative basis, and also figuring out what the best legislation could be, and understanding the importance of, if there's legislation that is passed, that it's accompanied by a budget to do the work.
Okay, thanks, Judy. That's great.
I just made a couple of notes that I just wanted to let you guys know. So one, on the native plant list that you were saying, we, like part of a RISCC project, this Northeast Invasive Species and Climate Change, we've been pushing a little bit more into the ornamental plant area because of the importance for reducing invasions. And so we sent out a request last summer for inventories from different nurseries across the Northeast. And so we have compiled about 150 inventories of both like traditional and native plant nurseries. And that extends, I saw a question in the chat of whether Maryland is the Northeast. Maryland is the Northeast in our minds. So like that extends down to Virginia, actually. So yes, if you hear more about folks who are looking to compile lists of what's being sold today, I have that information, and we're trying to figure out what to do with it. Honestly, it'll probably end up as a resource through the RISCC network at some point in the next year-ish time period. And the other thing, Judy, that what you were saying made me think of is one of the things that we've been pushing for the Northeast in the New England area, because they're so low resourced in terms of those risk assessments, is that we've made basically just like a Google shared drive for everybody to put existing risk assessments in. And we did a bunch of the work actually of like gathering those and trying to standardize them and make sure that the taxonomy was correct and like what all was in this big folder. But even if you're not able to use somebody else's exact risk assessment, a lot of the data is similar in two different ones. So if you're looking for evidence that, like, for example, the species escapes cultivation, and you can look to Virginia's risk assessment for that plant and see that they've looked for whether it escapes cultivation, like that same piece of evidence would be relevant and gets you further faster.
Well, I think both that information, both those pieces of information, those databases, I think I'm definitely personally interested in, and also interested as part of a group at the Maryland Sierra Club that's been looking at legislation.
Awesome.
Another comment and another way to do education that's actually quite important is to look at the counties in Maryland and look at the lists of plants that are acceptable or required. It depends how it's put together. The plant list that the counties have for developers, for instance, or the plant lists the counties have, and also the state, for what plants can be planted either on roadsides or on public properties. So you can look at both what plants are on those lists for public use and what plants are on that list for private commercial use. And if people work with counties on that, I think that can make a really big difference.
Cool.
One other thing really quick, in Maryland, we have the Maryland Invasive Species Council that puts out invaders of the month. Sometimes it's not every month, but they do a good job. They're like press releases. And those help. There's efforts going on, but they don't get into every citizen's mailbox or email box or whatever. But they need to be marketed more. Okay, Mark has his hand up, and anyone else? We should probably wrap up.
First, I want to thank Judy for getting the running bamboo bill passed, so that as of October 1st, you can force your neighbor to get rid of it. Isn't that great? Secondly, I want to say another tool that's worked very well, throwing in economic justifications, is I've succeeded, many of us, we show how these trees fell on the highway because of non-native invasive vine, and it takes 10 minutes to stop a tree with cut stump. So that's, the economics really worked well. So that's a tool. And Bethany, you may know about that. That's a tool that helps a lot. And another tool that has helped a lot around here is on health. And of course, Japanese barberry, where you have a big patch and don't have good deer control, you do increase the risk of Lyme disease from deer ticks by a factor of 8. So that and Oriental bush honeysuckle. So you can throw in health stuff too.
I really want to build on what Mark said there in terms of the bamboo bill. There was a bamboo bill passed in the Maryland legislature this year, but it is actually an enabling bill, which means that it's not law throughout Maryland. You have to go to your county or your local jurisdiction and convince them to pass the provisions that are in the bamboo bill. And those include, for instance, that going forward, you cannot plant or sell running bamboos, invasive running bamboos. But you can't go after your neighbor in this. You have to go after your county and make sure that there are rules passed.
Well, you can go to your neighbor through your county if the rules.
That's correct. Yes. But it's one more example of how people need to be active in their neighborhood. They need to be active in their town or city. They need to be active in their county and then throughout Maryland. And if you want to go all the way, you can go nationally too. But I think people can have more influence locally, but locally at all levels. And that's in terms of both laws and education.
Okay, thank you. Bethany, did you have any other comments about that, or?
No, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much for speaking. This is really interesting, and I think we're all going to be wanting to have like a follow-up whole conference to discuss this. Are you going to have any, the RISC group, are they going to have, you all going to have any talks about this? Because it's such a huge topic about assisted migrations.
We have, we did touch on it a little bit at the last RISC symposium. Those are typically in like January or February online. So if you go, Jill, you're probably already a member of RISC Network, but if you go to the RISC Network website, there's a link to sign up to our listserv, and we push out information about upcoming presentations. We spend a lot of time doing synthesis of research and pushing that information out to the listserv around invasive species and climate change. So that's the content that you will get if you sign up for the listserv every couple of weeks.
Thank you so much, Bethany. Obviously, people are very interested in this, and that's super exciting, actually. At one point, there were 190 people I saw on this Zoom, which was awesome. And a lot of thank yous and great presentations going through the chat as well. So I think it was very well received, and it's great information. It's exciting to hear people working on this.
Yeah.
I also share that we have talks scheduled all the way through November every month. And the next one is an interesting follow-on by Ellen Lake, scheduled for July 25th, biological control of invasive plants using insects. So we had an earlier talk on biological control also, which was so much interest in that we followed on with another one. So we're trying to, get this sort of information out there as much as we can. So I will turn it back to Jill, but I just wanted to thank you and let you know that you lots of people are going, yay, this is great.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
We definitely have a very interested and well-educated membership.
For sure.
So, all right, well, we're going to let you go, and thank you so much. And we'll keep in touch. And if we hear about talks that you all are sponsoring, we'll let the members know about that too.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Have a good evening.
All right. Enjoy your summer.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.